Let me ask you a question. Do you remember the last time you felt guilty? Maybe you copied a little too much of your friend's homework. Maybe you didn't tell your girlfriend the whole story about what happened at the party. Maybe you lingered a little too long on that website. Maybe you told your stepmom you were going one place, and you did, but with a different crowd than you told her you would be there with. There's all sorts of things that we can feel guilty about. And no matter how old we get, it seems like our reaction is a lot like a 5-year-old. We hide, stretch the truth, make up excuses, or try to cover it up altogether. When we feel guilty, we get really good at hiding. We all have all sorts of hiding tricks. We avoid our landing leader or the coaches in our lives. We try to not make eye contact with our teachers. We ghost our friends. We may even turn off our location services or hide our location. We do everything we can to act as though nothing happened, even though on the inside, we know what we did was wrong and it's eating us up. And this isn't just what we do with other people. If we believe in God, chances are good that our guilt causes us to hide from Him too. We know God knows what we did is wrong, so we back away from our relationship with Him. It's easy to hide something we did from the people around us, but it's much more complicated to hide from God. We can't actually run away from Him, so we just start to make Him less and less a part of our lives. No matter what it looks like for you, we all tend to let guilt get in the way of our faith. I don't know what's been causing you to feel guilt, but chances are that the entire time you've discussed this topic, you've had something on your mind. If you're ready for something new, I want to give you a couple steps that you can start talking about now. 1, get real about where you feel about guilt. This can be really tough, especially if you've hidden something so deep that you feel numb to it. But think about where you feel that lingering guilt now. Be honest with yourself about it, acknowledge it, journal about it, and even put it down in a note on your phone. Just get honest. The second thing, remember that guilt is no match for God's grace. Ask God to remind you that He is with you and He's for you. Even on those days that you feel guilty, ask Him to cover your guilt with an overwhelming reality of His grace. Listen to the Easter matters, and that God's love matters, and that you matter no matter what. Jesus is bigger than our guilt. And if Jesus gives us grace, it's for our taking. So if you feel old guilt kicking in, ask God to give you a new reaction. And the third thing, keep showing up and speaking up. Do the opposite of what guilt may have guided you to do in the past. Instead of hiding, show up to your landing leader and let them know what's going on. Show up and hang out with your friends. Show up to meetups with your leaders. After the resurrection, Peter didn't hide from Jesus. It would have been easier to, but he didn't do it. Like Peter, just keep showing up. Thankfully, we're not the first people to have these kinds of experiences with guilt. The Bible provides plenty of examples that we can learn from. We're going to talk about one of them today. For the last few weeks, as a part of this Easter season, we've been in a series called Afterlife. We've looked at people who physically saw Jesus after the resurrection. See, when you see a friend who died, now walking around alive, it changes you. For many people, their lives were radically different after they saw the resurrected Jesus. Their life after, or their afterlife, was dramatically changed, and that includes a guy named Peter. Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends and a key leader during the early days for the Christian movement. But Peter had some run-ins with guilt and shame, just like we do sometimes. Peter was known as being Jesus' loud friend. We all have them, and if you don't, then I'm sorry, but you're probably the loud friend. And the worst example of when this happened was when Jesus was sentenced to die on the cross. When Jesus was arrested, Peter literally cut off a dude's ear defending Jesus. It's not a recommended strategy to prove your loyalty to a friend, but hey, at least he was there for Jesus. But then just hours later, when Jesus was given a sketchy, bogus trial, Peter stood nearby and lied 3 separate times about his connection to Jesus. He even denied knowing him. I mean, I almost feel guilty for Peter. What a betrayal to end his story, right? But like we've talked about in the series, Jesus' death wasn't the end of the story. Easter happens, the tomb was empty, Jesus is alive. The whole direction of the story changes, which is awesome, unless you're Peter. He probably had some mixed feelings. He probably thought, I'm so glad Jesus is back. But does that mean that I have to face him after what I did to him? To Peter, it's possible that the resurrection was a reminder of the guilt that he felt. And if he felt guilt, I sometimes wonder if he ran through all the same phases of guilt that we do. I wonder if he wanted to lie, exaggerate, defend himself, or even hide from Jesus altogether. A few days later, Jesus was on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Peter was on a boat with other disciples and saw Jesus. They went to shore. Jesus made breakfast and brought up the thing that no doubt was weighing Peter down. Check this out. Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. And then Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" 3 times. In other words, for every time Peter denied knowing Jesus, Jesus gives Peter another chance. And in giving him a chance, Peter knows he is loved and forgiven. Jesus wants Peter to know that he has a second chance. He even tells Peter that he wants him to continue to lead, which is why he said, "Feed my sheep." This exchange is so interesting. Jesus asked Peter if he still loves him. As humiliating and terrible as it was for Peter to deny Jesus, here was a change to make it right. Even though Peter may have given up on himself, Jesus hadn't given up on him. Peter couldn't have given into his guilt and gone into hiding. But that isn't what Jesus wanted for Peter. Jesus didn't want Peter's life to be defined by guilt. He wanted Peter to experience grace. Peter knew Jesus had been killed, and he saw Jesus after he came back to life. This proved to Peter that Jesus was capable of offering him the grace that he needed to forgive himself. The resurrection showed Peter the power Jesus had. And Peter's encounter with Jesus on that beach showed Jesus chose to offer him that powerful grace. The resurrection proved that guilt didn't have to destroy Peter's faith. Instead, grace could destroy his guilt and fuel his faith. Because of grace, Peter was no longer controlled by his guilt. Because of grace, Peter accepted the love Jesus offered him. Because of grace, Peter traveled around the world preaching about the same grace that changed his life. Think of it this way. Because of the resurrection, Peter knew he was forgiven. The resurrection proved that our guilt is no match for God's grace. We don't have to let guilt change our faith anymore. Instead, we get to let grace change our guilt. We know that talking about God's grace is one thing, but experiencing it is something else entirely. And that's why we have landing leaders. We want you to have a safe place to fight for that grace when your guilt feels too heavy. The landing is the safest place for you to discover this alongside your friends and your landing leaders. Your leaders have gone through training on how to handle some pretty tough conversations, and they have people that they get real with about their guilt as well. They have encountered grace, and they will pass that same grace on to you. Why? Because that's what the resurrected Jesus demonstrated in Peter's life, and that's why Peter's afterlife was so powerful while he was still alive on earth. Because of the resurrection, Peter realized that grace is greater than guilt, and because of Easter, you can realize that truth for you as well.